you noticed how African nations are responding to Western pressures lately? Something remarkable just happened in West Africa, and we need to talk about it because the implications go far beyond what you might think at first glance. On October 10th, the United States announced that Malian citizens would need to post a bond of up to $10,000 just to apply for a tourist or business visa. That is not a fee you pay if you overstay. That's money you have to put down before they will even consider your application. Just 48 hours later, Mali's foreign ministry issued their response. They are implementing the same exact requirement for American citizens, $10,000. Same terms, same conditions. But this is where things take an unexpected turn. 5 days before this standoff began, Mali made another decision. They removed the French Revolution from their national school curriculum entirely. This is Africa Insights with Hikma, and today we're looking at how these two decisions connect to tell a much bigger story and what happens when nations decide they're done accepting terms they never agreed to in the first place. Let me walk you through what happened, because the timing here is everything. On October 9th, Mali's Minister of National Education issued a memo to schools across the country. Starting immediately, the 1789 French Revolution would no longer be taught in 9th grade classrooms. The ministry said they were adopting the curriculum to better reflect the national context, which is diplomatic language for something much more significant that we will get into. The very next day, the US Embassy in Mali announced what they're calling a visa bond pilot program. Beginning October 23rd, any Malian national applying for certain types of US visas would be required to post a refundable bond ranging from $5,000 to $10,000 before their application could move forward. The stated reason from the US side is border security and ensuring that visitors return home after their visas expire. That's the official explanation. What they don't emphasize is that this program is being rolled out across more than a dozen African countries, not European ones, not Asian countries with comparable or higher visa overstay rates, but specifically African nations. Then on October 12th, Mali's foreign ministry released a statement that caught a lot of people off guard. They announced they would impose an identical requirement on US citizens seeking visas to Mali. The foreign minister went further, stating that the US program violates a bilateral agreement signed between the two countries back in 2005 that was supposed to guarantee visa access. What makes this hit even harder is that most countries, when faced with this kind of policy from a major power like the United States, will lodge a diplomatic protest or quietly negotiate behind closed doors. But Mali, no. They matched the policy dollar for dollar and made it public. Now, if you just look at headlines, this seems like a straightforward diplomatic spat. One country imposes visa restrictions, another retaliates in kind, but that reading misses what's actually happening here. The real story starts on October 9th, the day before the US announced those visa bonds. That's when Mali removed the French Revolution from their school curriculum. Now let me tell you what Malian students have been learning for generations. Imagine you are a young student sitting in a classroom in Bamako. You open your history textbook and there it is. Weeks of material on the French Revolution. You study the storming of the Bastille, memorize the dates, write essays analyzing the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It's tested material. Your ability to move to the next grade level partly depends on how well you understand events that happened in Paris in 1789. Meanwhile, the Mali Empire, which your country is literally named after and which was one of the wealthiest and most powerful empires, gets condensed into a chapter or two. Mansa Musa, who was so extraordinarily rich, might get a few paragraphs. The University of Timbuktu, which housed thousands of students studying astronomy, mathematics, and Islamic law during Europe's medieval period, might get mentioned in the passing. So this is what colonial education systems were designed to do. They were about teaching people what knowledge matters, whose history is important, whose stories deserve to be centered. When Mali's Minister of National Education said they are suspending French history to adopt, the curriculum to the national context, what they're really doing is dismantling a system that was never designed to serve Malian interests in the first place. This is where things get interesting, because Mali is not operating in isolation. There is a pattern developing across West Africa that deserves attention. I already made a video talking about Burkina Faso's response to a proposal from the Trump administration. The US had been approaching various African countries with what they call third country deportation agreements. Essentially, they wanted these nations to accept people being expelled from the United States who were not even from those countries. Several nations signed on. Now let's look at what's happening with Mali. They reject the idea of centering French colonial history in their education system. Within days, the United States imposes financial barriers on Malian citizens trying to get visas, and Mali responds with an identical measure aimed at American citizens. So, Mali is also led by a military government that came to power through coup. Assimi Goïta in Mali have positioned himself explicitly as Pan-Africanist leader committed to ending what they described as neo-colonial relationships with the Western powers. Countries with the same ideology are now facing pressure from the United States in the form of visa restrictions and other diplomatic tools. Here is what I think is being misunderstood on the American side of all this. Visa bonds work as leverage when you're dealing with a government that desperately needs to maintain good relations with the United States. When access to American markets or American aid or American diplomatic support is seen as essential as well. But Mali and also Burkina Faso are not those governments anymore, or at least they're betting they don't have to be. Mali's economy doesn't rely heavily on American tourism. The number of US citizens visiting Mali annually is relatively small, and while the visa bonds will certainly affect Malians who want to travel to the United States, the people most able to afford a $10,000 bond are likely wealthy enough that it becomes an inconvenience rather than a prohibition. What the policy does accomplish, though, is something Washington might not have fully anticipated. In a region where governments are actively trying to build narratives around sovereignty and independence from Western influence, these kinds of measures don't create pressure. They create validation. Think about how this looks from the perspective of someone in Mali. The country that colonized you for decades just got removed from your textbooks the same week another Western power tries to impose economic barriers on your citizens' ability to travel, and then your government does not apologize, doesn't negotiate, or doesn't try to smooth things over. They respond with the exact same measure within 48 hours. We need to talk about France's role in all of this. France colonized Mali from 1892 until 1960, nearly 70 years of direct control. But independence did not mean the end of French influence. France maintained military bases, significant economic control, and overwhelming cultural dominance. French remained the official language of the government and also education. The currency Mali uses, the CFA franc, is actually controlled by the French treasury in Paris. For decades after independence, this arrangement was simply accepted as the way things were. But over the past 5 years, things have shifted. Anti-French sentiment has grown dramatically across West Africa. In 2022, Mali expelled the French ambassador and kicked out French troops that had been stationed in the country since 2013, supposedly to help fight jihadist insurgencies in the north. Mali has also moved significantly closer to Russia, inviting Wagner Group mercenaries to provide security. The removal of French history from school curricula is part of this larger reorientation. Mali is saying that French perspectives, French language, and French cultural priorities will no longer be the default setting in Malian institutions. Now, all this brings us to the deeper question that goes beyond Mali or even West Africa. What happens when countries decide that sovereignty, the ability to make decisions based on their own interests and values, is worth more than maintaining relationships that require constant accommodation? The traditional playbook in international relations has been pretty straightforward. Powerful countries offer aid, market access, diplomatic recognition, or other benefits. Less powerful countries accept those offers even when the terms are not particularly favorable, because the alternative, isolation or economic pressure, seems worse. What we are seeing now in parts of Africa is a willingness to test that assumption. Mali, Burkina Faso, and other nations are essentially saying they would rather face consequences on their own terms than accept the deals they consider deeming or contrary to their interests. Now let's come back to where they started, in the classroom. Education is one of the most powerful tools for shaping how people understand themselves and their place in the world. When a curriculum dedicates weeks to studying events in France but rushes through the history of your own region, that sends a message about what knowledge is valuable. When you can name French revolutionaries but not the leaders of your own historical empires, that reflects choices made about whose stories deserve to be told in depth. Colonial education systems were designed not just to teach literacy or numeracy, but to teach a particular worldview in which European civilization was the center and standard against which everything else was measured. Even after countries gained independence, many of those curricula remained largely intact because changing education systems is complex, expensive, and politically fraught. What Mali is doing now is making a choice about what the next generation will learn to value. They're saying that Malian and African history will be centered in Malian schools, that students will develop a deep understanding of their own heritage before they study European history, that the Mali Empire and the scholars of Timbuktu will get the attention that the French Revolution used to receive. The French Revolution can still be mentioned as part of world history. It was undeniably significant, of course, but it won't be the same, centerpiece anymore. That space is being reserved for Mali's own story. And when you combine that educational shift with the willingness to stand up to US pressure on visa policies, you're teaching students that their country and their history are worth defending. That accommodation to more powerful nations has limits. That self-respect is not negotiable. It remains to be seen if the United States will escalate further. Visa bans are one level of pressure, but the country has other tools like economic sanctions, cuts to aid programs, diplomatic isolation, and if the US decides to use those tools more aggressively, that changes the equation significantly and could force Mali to make harder choices about whether this path is sustainable. There's also the question of whether this approach actually serves ordinary Malians well. Visa restrictions hurt regular people more than they hurt governments. Students who want to study abroad, families trying to visit relatives in the United States, professionals seeking opportunities, these are the people who bear the immediate costs of the standoff. For generations, the dynamic between Western powers and African nations followed a fairly predictable pattern. Western countries would set terms and African countries would accept them, even when those terms were unfavorable or even humiliating, because the cost of resistance seemed too high. And maybe what happens next in Mali will influence how other nations think about their own relationships with major powers. That makes this story worth paying attention to, regardless of where you're from, what you think about the specific policies involved, of course. And that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching the whole video and sticking around. So if you want to stay informed about the stories that are reshaping Africa's place in the world, make sure you are subscribed to Africa Insights with Hikmah. There is a lot more to come, and goodbye for now.